Um, so, Hello, welcome everyone. My name is Garrett Schumann, and I'm here joined today with my research partner, who is in Scotland right now, Joseph McHardy. Say hello,
Uh,
Joe.
Hello, everybody. It's nice to be here. I hope you can hear me. I am slightly without all my stuff, so we're relying on this computer's microphone. So if that's okay, that's great.
Yes, we can hear you, and your
Great.
charming accent is coming through. So,
As is yours.
yes, it's part of the reason we work together. So we'll start. So today's presentation is about the life and music of Vicente Lusitano, who is a 16th century Afro-Portuguese composer whom Joe and I have been researching since 2020. And we're going to share everything that we've learned about him, talk about our experience working together over the last 2 years, and also share some recordings that are from performances Joe led this summer in the UK. Joe partnered with a fabulous organization in the UK called the Chineke Foundation to assemble an ensemble and do a tour. And so we have at least audio from one of those performances, and then also audio from the ensemble's appearance on the BBC. So we have some music that you'll be able to hear, and then we'll take questions. So I'll just introduce myself a little bit and then give Joe an opportunity to introduce himself as well. Thank you so much for being here, Stefano. So I'm a faculty member at the University of Michigan. I teach an LSA, and at this semester at the School of Music, so the students of mine who are here from one of my LSA classes. So thank you for being here. I'm a composer by training. I went to Michigan for my graduate degrees in composition, but after that, began doing a lot of research, particularly on composers like Lusitano, who are people of African descent, women composers from other oppressed populations who do not appear in typical curricular materials at music schools. And so a lot of the work that I've done over the last few years involves trying to address that problem. And that's kind of what Joe and I have been doing too with Lusitano in a more focused way. Joe, do you want to introduce yourself a little bit?
Hi, so my name is Joe. I am a choral conductor, and I work at City of London School, conducting one of the choirs there. Although obviously my views, what I say does not represent the views of my employer. I'm also a researcher at the University of Nottingham in their Department of Black Studies and their Department of Music, and I'm writing my PhD on Vicente Lusitano. And I have Garrett to thank, as do many, many people, for introducing me to Lusitano via his wonderful article in Fan magazine, which I found in 2020 after a Twitter thing that we might talk about as we go through. But yeah, thank you for having me. It's very nice to be here. And it's dark here, but I guess it's still light for you, so that's nice.
And
In the
I'll
future.
just extend gratitude also to the library. This is the third presentation like this I've given since 2019. We had some others planned that it couldn't happen because of the pandemic, and they've been such a wonderful partner for this research, which often has trouble finding a home and with institutions. So Joe and I we're going to be doing sort of a back and forth today because there are two of us here. And so it's not going to be like a paper presentation exactly. We're going to begin just giving you some information about who Vicente Lusitano was, why we think he matters, and then we're going to go through some critical years in his life and experience as a historical figure, because one of the really interesting things about Lusitano, at least to me and Joe, is that he represents his legacy in music history represents a lot of the issues with why composers like him, people like him, are not as well known. So, like I said, he was an Afro-Portuguese composer, music theorist, and priest. The priest we included because he very intriguingly converted from Catholicism to Protestantism late in what we know of his career. His known works include a book of motets called the Liber Primus Epigrammatum, a Protestant motet called Beati Omnes, a madrigal. He also produced a good amount of scholarship, mostly related to his teaching as a composition and music theory teacher, but he also has this large manuscript treatise about improvisation and counterpoint and composition, which is a really unique source on that, particularly improvisation. And he's a really interesting figure because he is a famous person in Renaissance music history, but only in a really, really narrow way, which is his connection to this other composer, an Italian contemporary named Nicola Vicentino. The two faced off in a dispute that we'll describe in a little bit more detail in a little bit in 1551. And because of Lusitano's involvement in that incident and sort of the propaganda around it that followed the actual event, Lusitano is a known name, but only as a name. His music has not been studied very much until Joe's and my research, basically, and not performed very much except beginning of the last couple of years. And so there's an interesting lesson there in why could you be famous but also not studied. Joe, is there anything you want to add?
No, I mean, I think we can talk a little bit more about the background of Portugal and the Black experience in Portugal when we get there. But no, I think we can move forward.
Absolutely, we will definitely do that. So, well, this cool. Is unelegant. Okay, let's go to the next slide. It's trapped. There we go. Okay. We can edit that out in post, I'm sure. No, I'm kidding. Okay, so why does Lusitano matter? So he's one of the earliest documented European composers of African descent. He is not the first, most likely. There's some interesting research about a late medieval composer who was probably of African descent named Lorenzo di Firenze. That's other people are doing that hasn't been published yet. There are also composers in Africa long before Lusitano who wrote music, who wrote it down. And so he's not the first Black composer. He's not the first Black composer to write their music down, but he is one of the first in Europe that we know about who we know published music. And so he's a very important figure in that sense.
I would also say that what's particularly resonant for us today is that being an Afro-Portuguese composer from the 1550s, so some 80 years after the landing, I think I'm right, my 80 years, is it 1470? Mm-hmm. The landing of enslaved, kidnapped African persons in Lagos in Portugal. He is one of the earliest examples of an African descendant person working in Europe in the period of white supremacy. And I think that's quite an important thing to note. And I think that's in many ways what makes him so resonant today, is that the beginnings of white supremacy are already pretty firmly established in Portugal by 1550s, and so it's particularly resonant when we're thinking about Black identity and white supremacy today.
Yeah, and I'll just add that when composers of African descent are talked about in academic settings and performance settings of classical music, there's a lot of people obviously talk about living composers with that identity because it's hard, it takes more effort to ignore them because they're, around. There's a lot of composers from the 20th century, especially in the United States, that we talk about. And the 19th century, there are a lot of African-American composers in the 19th century who actually aren't talked about very much for some of the same issues. There's some notable figures in the 18th century and 16th century. The older ones are less famous. But having Lusitano alive in the 16th century, participating in this tradition in the 16th century is really, really important if you're trying to make the case that for an enormous swath of classical music's history, there have been Black people participating in the same spaces, writing the same kind of music at the same level as the composers we usually talk about, who of course are all white. His music is also really good, so that's one of the most incredible things about Joe's and my work together is before Joe started performing and rehearsing it, we did these like synth renderings of them using computers, and we were just able to hear these pieces really for the first time in hundreds of years, and it's incredible for the style of music. It's really, really incredible. And, oh yeah, so we've mentioned his scholarship a little bit, and as I already said, his legacy, his experience as a historical figure really outlines sort of the practices of erasure that are really prevalent in classical music's history making, and that's why he is such a compelling figure for me, and makes him a very valuable person to study, in my opinion, in addition to all of these other things. I shouldn't have done so much fussiness with my presentation. So, okay. So here's a timeline that sort of outlines the rest of what we're going to talk about after we go through these critical years in Lusitano's life and legacy and our experience working together. Joe's gonna introduce his music, and then we're gonna play the recordings, and then we can take questions from anyone. So we're gonna begin in 1551, which is, other than the year of his birth, which is maybe 1522 or 1520. 1551 is definitely the most important year in Lusitano's life. It's the year that he published his book of motets that we know, Liber Primus Epigrammatum. It's the year of his encounter with Nicola Vicentino, which we'll go into more detail about, which resulted from those motets. And it's also the year that he arrived in Rome from Portugal. So he departed Portugal in 1550 with a noble family, the Lancastre family, who were the head of that family was the papal ambassador of Portugal to the Vatican. And he arrived in early 1551 and it had these incredible moments. Joe, do you want to talk a little bit more about leading into 1551?
Yeah, sure, thank you. So we assume that Vicente was born somewhere around the 1520s. My brain is completely, am I thinking 1530s? No, I think in 1520s. We're thinking he was born in the 1520s. Robert Stevenson, who was the first English-speaking academic or writer to think about and to work on Lusitano, makes that assumption based on how long he thought Lusitano had been a priest for when he published, and based on some of the Lancastre family's activities. One of the Lancastres was bishop of the cathedral town in which Lusitano was born. The town of Olivença, which is now in Spain, was at the time in Portugal, right on the border with Spain and Portugal. And the population of Portugal in the 16th century was higher than one might imagine if one spends a lot of time, as I do, thinking about representations of the old days of Europe and what that looks like in popular culture. I think we tend to think of that as being quite white. And Portugal, Lisbon's population in the 1550s estimated around 10% African descended, around 3 to 4% in the region that Lusitano was born in. So not an unlikely place to find African descendant people. We might talk about his racialized identity as homem pardo. The first time that he's mentioned we might get a bit more into this, is like as Homem Pardo, that's in a 17th century biography. And that had quite a stable racialized meaning in Portugal in the 16th and 17th centuries. And it referred to either a free person of African descent or a person who was descended from African descended people or African people and European people. So someone we might call mixed race today, someone we might describe as racialized as black today. That was not uncommon. Some historians speculate that we think his mother might have been African descended and his father might have been a white person of some elite access, because Lusitano was literate and able to write music and was able to write in Latin, we know, as well as Spanish and Italian. So he had some access to training there, and we would assume that would mean that his father was someone with access to those things that he could give him. And I think that's something quite interesting, and that's not really been explored is thinking about, and sometimes we've thought a little bit, Garrett and I have been really inspired by historians like Marisa Fuentes to try and think a little bit carefully, full of care, about what his mother's identity, the character of his mother, if she was an African woman, she was an African descended woman, or indeed an enslaved African descended woman. What might that mean for us when we're thinking about Lusitano's identity? It's really important. The African descended community in Portugal, many people were enslaved. We know that, and those who were not enslaved, we think, were poor. We know that there was certain legal impediments. We might go a little bit more into that. But to think about a little bit just about Black identity in Portugal, I've been really inspired by Erin Kathleen Rowe's book, Black Saints, which talks a lot about the confraternities and the ways in which African descended people were able to form societies of mutual aid, to come together and to claim their space as sort of full citizens in one particular arena, and that was the arena of religion. So it's interesting that Lusitano it becomes a priest, because it is at the time an arena. It's a space in which the Catholic Church and Portuguese society is grappling with this question, which is, these African people have souls, but we're going to enslave them. So what does that mean? There is an equality somewhere that can be claimed. It's a complicated equality, and it's an equality that is continually undermined by white supremacy. And we find that African achievements, African descended achievements, the confraternities, the power that they get, is kind of constantly undermined and chipped away at during the 16th, 17th, especially centuries, into the 18th century, which might take us later. So if I've not gone on too much of a diversion, just to try and place Lusitano in Portugal and in the world of African descended people in Portugal, I think is really important, and to say that, we know from some rather horrific descriptions by Northern European visitors that Portugal was much had a much larger Black population than other countries in Europe. So to find a Black person who has managed to write, to have their compositions survive, suggests to me that there were considerably more Black people making music. And we know that from documentary evidence, the beautiful picture of some sackbut and shawm players from the 16th century. There's a character called Giacomo Feo in one of the kind of chronicles of the time, one of the Duke of Braganza's shawm players. So there's quite a known amount of musical activity amongst African-descended people in Portugal at the time.
Yes, and there, kind of along those lines, there were already musical styles, types of pieces that we consider, you know, classically classical, that came from the influence of enslaved African and indigenous people like the saraband and the chaconne. And so Lusitano is not an anomaly at all if we recognize all of the things that are going on. When we get to 1551 and he's in Rome, he publishes his motets with the Dorico Brothers Publishing House, which is a very prominent Roman publisher at the time. It's dedicated to the oldest son in the Lancastre family, so it's presumed that Lusitano, in addition to knowing him, was maybe the son was his benefactor in publishing this, and Lusitano could have been his tutor. And one of those pieces, which we'll hear, the Regina Caeli, is performed in May of 1551 at an Italian noble's house, and it catches the attention of Nicola Vicentino, who confronts Lusitano and challenges him. It's kind of like a duel. The most recent research on this dispute that they have in the summer of 1551 describes it not as like an informal argument, but a highly formalized legalistic process. There were like 3 days of oral arguments. They had to submit written testimony ultimately because no decision could be made. And Vicentino challenged Lusitano to basically defend every composer writing vocal music at the time and their inability to understand analytically how they were writing. That's the best way I can put it without getting too technical. But what ended up happening, there was this long debate and discussion, and ultimately Lusitano was determined by a panel of 3 judges to be victorious. And what ends up happening is Vicentino leaves Rome for 4 years and works on a large treatise of his own, in which he publishes, it's a very famous work of 16th century music theory, and Vicentino revisits the dispute, but includes pretty egregious fabrications and misrepresentations. He changes the words of Lusitano's written testimony, and he intentionally misunderstands a text that Lusitano publishes in the interim in order to make it seem like even though Lusitano was the winner of the dispute, that actually Vicentino was the victor because his ideas are more important, essentially. So it's a really incredible controversy and dramatic moment. For Lusitano, after the dispute, he publishes his the first edition of a composition manual, which he uses with his students. He seems to leave Rome probably to around 1556 or 1557, so this would have been after Vicentino's treatise was published. There was probably a lot of political and social awkwardness. Lusitano was he wasn't heartily defended. One of the judges wrote a manuscript excoriating Vicentino, but it was never published. And so throughout Lusitano's experience in history, there's this huge advantage to bad work that's published over better documented work or more reliable work that's not published. And so technology plays a huge role in this. But Lusitano also didn't really seem to care because maybe he knew that he won, and he also had to continue on with his career. Like Joe said, there were a lot of limitations placed by the church on black priests at the time, so he could not get a position as a maestro di cappella or something, so he had to support himself by teaching. And so he ends up having this sort of peripatetic career traveling to different places in Italy, and then eventually he goes to Germany looking for teaching jobs. He publishes 3 editions of that composition manual, the first in Rome in 1553, the second and third are published in Venice in 1558 and then 1561, maybe. And then there's also his Protestant motet, Beati Omnes, is dated 1562, I think, and that's we have in a part book in southern Germany. So at some point in the early 1560s, he's left Italy. He's converted. We have a letter that shows he's converted to Protestantism. He's married and attempts to get work in the, who's the Duke? Duke Christoph?
So Christoph of Württemberg. And the interesting thing about it, I suppose, is that something that I found out from Philippe Canguilhem, who does a lot of work on Lusitano in France, is that Lusitano made the decision to convert to Calvinism rather than to Lutheranism, which again makes him quite a unique figure. I'm sitting in Scotland at the moment, which also went through its own Calvinist Reformation, and obviously Calvinism has quite an effect on religious music. It often makes it much more simple in Scotland, to the extent that it pretty much choral music sort of, if I say died out, someone will say no, it didn't. But maybe we don't have so much music from the 16th and 17th centuries for church use in Scotland because of the restrictions of a particular type of Calvinism. What I've often thought, and what tend to be sort of told, is that, oh well, it was awful for composers. No person working in ornate church music would choose to be Calvinist, and yet we have an example of. I know there are different types of Calvinism, and Southern French Calvinism has a different kind of attitude to music. But it's interesting that we have a composer who does choose Calvinism, and that Calvinism that he chooses makes him quite difficult to employ in the court of Christoph of Württemberg, because that is a Lutheran court. So it's an interesting, to me, it sort of makes Lusitano a really interesting figure in terms of his own personal beliefs and his own personal kind of journey. That there are certain things that he was choosing that were not necessarily advantageous to his career, but clearly something that was important to his conscience at some point. And again, I'm not a church historian, but I would love, if anybody knows any, I would love to know. I think he might be the first documented person of African descent to convert to Protestantism from Catholicism. He's definitely the first person of African descent to write for both the Catholic and Protestant traditions. In fact, I think he's the first person that we know of Iberian birth to write for both the Protestant and Catholic traditions. So he's pretty awesome.
Yeah, with the timing of his life, as Joe mentioned before, Lusitano is this amazing icon of a world transforming because of European colonialism and the transatlantic slave trade, and Europe transforming. And then also he converts from Catholicism to Protestantism. So he's in the middle of this huge historical confessional dispute as well. This is about where the trail ends of what we know about Lusitano. We don't know what happened. There's some evidence to suggest maybe he went to France, because that's where the manuscript of his large music theory treatise ended up. And
if he had done so, he would have gone smack into the wars of religion, as far as I'm aware. Again, I'm not a church historian, but it would have been for a Calvinist, it would have been a difficult. The second half of his life would have been quite turbulent, as far as I'm aware.
The turbulence doesn't end there for him, unfortunately. So we'll go through these next 2 years pretty quickly, because these are posthumous years and kind of fallow years in terms of Lusitano scholarship. 1752 is significant because this is when the first printed biographical reference to Lusitano is published by a Portuguese historian named Diogo Barbosa Machado. And what's really significant, so what's happened in between, there are 2 significant things that have happened in between when the trail runs cold on Lusitano in 1752. The first is in the late 16th century and early 17th century, we see the influence of Vicentino's fabricated, misrepresented narrative about the dispute really take hold with Italian music scholars. So there are a lot of incidents, even people who had access to the other sources that contradicted what Vicentino says. We see a lot of scholars just reproduce uncritically what Vicentino wrote, which creates, I mentioned at the beginning, Lusitano is a famous person, but only in this very reduced way. And this is why, because he's portrayed as kind of a conservative, not interesting musical thinker by Vicentino, which is not true at all, but it served Vicentino's interests. So that narrative really takes hold. Machado reproduces it in his history. We see around the same time John Hawkins, an English music historian, writes a very important music history, does the same thing. Thomas Morley before him did that as well. But the other more significant thing perhaps is that one of Machado's sources is this manuscript from the 17th century by a Portuguese scholar, which is where we get the documented evidence of Lusitano's racialized identity. He's referred to as homem pardo, which, as Joe said, is a pretty common and consistently used word throughout, not before Lusitano's life, after Lusitano's life, and in the 17th century to refer to certain kinds of mixed-race people of African descent. And that work is one of Machado's sources, and he omits that information. So we have the first published and widely dispersed biographical entry on Lusitano, and critically, it does not portray him very fairly in terms of his most famous event, the dispute with Vicentino, rather, and also does not describe him as a person of African descent. So in every subsequent entry about him, what is picked up is what Machado has published. And so all the major European classical histories, Grove, which until next month is still problematic because Joe and I have revised the Grove article on Lusitano, and it's being published in a couple weeks.
Very grateful.
Yes, we'll talk more about that. So Grove, Gerber, all of these people, all these histories completely misrepresent Lusitano. Now at the time, this is what's interesting about 17th century Portugal, racial structures in 17th century Portugal, and particularly 18th century Europe, is that scientific racism has taken hold, and so the political stakes are we cannot recognize the humanity of people of African descent. So I don't know why Machado decided to omit this information about Lusitano's racialized identity. We'll never know. He omits other things that are easily proved, like the editions of Lusitano's scholarship that were printed. But the important thing is that he did omit it.
I mean, there are two things that strike me at this point in Portuguese or Lusophone history. The first is the rise of a very, very, very strong Pardo community in Brazil. Mm-hmm. To the extent that actually the Pardo community in one part of Brazil, which I can't remember to my shame right now off the top of my head, is pretty much autonomous and wealthy and things like that. And the second one, and this is something that I will ask Erin Rowe, is that it's a period in which the dispossession of black confraternities is happening. So you get as I mentioned before, you get these societies of mutual aid, these kind of guilds of African descended persons in Iberia. And as they become richer and more powerful, if you like, and more able to do things, you find successive attempts by white ecclesiastical and civil authorities to undermine them, to take them over, basically, to put people in place to say, oh, you can't run these, etc., etc. To the extent that there are still there are confraternities in it now with names that suggest that they were all black in places in Spain which haven't had a black membership for a very long time. So I think that this quite, as Garrett says, it's a really interesting time that this omission happens, but it also happens during a backdrop of dispossession of black and African descended persons in the Lusophone world, as far as I'm aware, and it's something that I need to look into much more at this point.
And there's definitely, Joe and I in our research have it's not like the most obvious it's a pretty obvious observation when you see these things, but there's definitely a parallel that we've identified with these like political and social acts of violence and dispossession against populations of African descended people in these places, and then also in archives and libraries and histories and that sort of thing. Archival violence is not a new concept. Other people have talked about this, and Lusitano is a great example of that. Also, just those Afro-Brazilian communities that are almost autonomous are also responsible for some of the most wonderful composers of African descent from this period as well. So Portugal and its colonial impact is really important to the early history of Black composers and classical music that we know about. So let's move on. We're going to fast forward 120 years-ish to 1870. And the reason I chose this year is because this is when the revisionism of Lusitano, and I mean that in a very positive way, this is when scholars who know better start striking back against the dominant narrative, which is still very influential in 2022. But 1870, and also at the time in the 1550s, people were defending Lusitano, or at least didn't agree with Vicentino. So there was conflict then. But in 1870, we see the first really extensive rejection of what Vicentino writes about the dispute with Lusitano, and then what has been reproduced in significant histories. There's a Portuguese scholar named Joaquim, I apologize for the pronunciation, Joaquim Vasconcelos, who writes a book on Portuguese musicians, and it's like 12 pages of writing on Lusitano, which is the most that's ever been printed to that point that I know of. And what he does the amazing thing of going back to the primary sources and seeing, do these things say what these histories claim that they do? And he finds that there's very clear evidence that what Vicentino has put forth is not supported both by what Lusitano wrote, which other historians had simply never considered, and also the other musical theoretical scholarship of that era, because one of the things Vicentino was trying to accomplish was make himself seem like an innovator. And Vasconcelos was like, no, especially in Iberian music theory, people have been thinking about these ideas for a long time before. And so this is a really significant date because we start to see this, an attempt to reclaim the historical narrative around Lusitano. We also see it not make a very big impact for issues of language bias that are pretty prevalent and influential on classical music history writ large in the United States and Europe. Around this time, a little bit later, there's also really important developments with Lusitano's manuscript treatise on counterpoint and improvisation, which has been sitting untouched in the Bibliothèque Nationale of France for hundreds of years. And there's a group of scholars who start to get really interested in it. Now, at this point, it is an anonymous work. None of these people know that it's connected to Lusitano. It's going to take about 100 more years for that connection to be drawn. But what they do know is that it has really interesting information, particularly about improvisation, which was a very prominent part of church music, classical music in the 16th century, that Lusitano participated in that tradition. But of course, because it's improvisation, it doesn't have the record of composed works that were printed and written down. And so Lusitano talks extensively in this treatise about the way counterpoint, extremely sophisticated counterpoint, could be improvised, and so it becomes a really attractive text because of that. About in the early 1900s, a French scholar named Henri Collet translates the treatise, or I guess transliterates, just puts it in print and does it in Spanish. I think it's in Spanish, but Lusitano has a lot of idiosyncratic spellings and things. So he cleans up the language a little bit and he puts it in print. It's still anonymous, but it's finally a little bit more accessible because you don't have to go to the shelf in the Bibliothèque Nationale anymore to engage with that. Anything else, Joe?
That is idiosyncrasy of, if that's a word, of spelling is to do with Portuguese spellings of Spanish words, which is pretty consonant of. It's written in Spanish with Portuguese spellings, and you could expect that from somebody who was born on the border between Portugal and Spain in the 16th century. So that's one of the, I think, one of the things, not the only thing, that was one of the things that made eventually people think, okay, this is going to be by Lusitano. This tracks with someone from that part of the world at that time. That kind of orthography.
Absolutely. Okay. Now we'll move up 100 more years about to 1977. This is one of, maybe next to 1551, one of the most important years in Lusitano, in the 500 years of Lusitano's life and legacy as a historical figure, because this is when a Portuguese scholar named Maria Alves Augusta Barbosa publishes her dissertation on Lusitano, and for the first time puts into print the information documenting his racialized identity. So she's the first scholar to go back to the 17th century manuscript that describes him as Homo Pardo and put it into a printed source. And it's really, really important. There were other critical breakthroughs prior to this. So there's beginning in the about 15 years before this, we see two important pieces of scholarship that continue the trend from 1870 of sort of reframing our understanding of Lusitano and Vicentino's encounter. There's a big piece of scholarship by Henry William Kaufman on Vicentino about all of his whole life and works, and he readdresses this and talks about the fabrications that Vicentino put in there. He talks about how Vicentino misrepresents Lusitano's writings and that sort of thing, and he's very open about it. And that's important, even though that narrative is still influential in 2022. And then Robert Stevenson, who becomes a very important, he's a hugely important scholar of composers of African descent and people working in classical music in different parts of the world, usually oppressed people. And in 1962, he writes the first major English language article on Lusitano, and he's the one who draws the connection between this manuscript and Lusitano, in part because of the weird spellings that Joe was talking about, and then also because
just Portuguese spellings. I'm going to stick up for Portuguese people.
Yes.
It's just Portuguese spellings.
Well, I think Robert Stevenson's special power as a musicologist is that he could read Portuguese as an American. So that's the reason why Vasconcelos, and there were some other Portuguese scholars around at the turn of the 20th century who were like, people need to respect Lusitano, his music is amazing, blah, 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 but it didn't penetrate because of the language, which is frankly unacceptable to me. But Robert Stevenson, he did a lot of work on African-descended composers in Brazil as well. He knew Portuguese, and that was his like skeleton key to figure out, oh yeah, this must be Lusitano. And so he, in 1962, he establishes that, and he actually does the first analysis of any of Lusitano's music, just a few measures from this motet Regina Caeli, which we brought up before, the motet that initiated the dispute between Vicentino and Lusitano. And it's kind of sad because at the end of this article, Stevenson is like, surely this will lead to a huge outpouring of scholarship in Lusitano because he's such an interesting figure, and that was 60 years ago, and we're only finally catching up to that need. But yes, Barbosa, she publishes her dissertation in 1977, which is a really fantastic work. In addition to its discussion of Lusitano's identity, she reinforces a lot of the arguments that Vasconcelos made 100 years before and brings in more sources to show that what Vicentino was trying to do was very clearly to use this incident and then the opportunity to write his own treatise about it afterwards to just make himself seem more important. And people bought into it. There were maybe political factors at the time too that we don't have time to discuss, but it's a really great lesson in how things make it into history, and that there's a lot of subjectivity and selectivity that goes into it, and it's not necessarily always about what we have documented evidence of. And after this, in 1983, Robert Stevenson publishes an article, which is the first English language article to talk about Lusitano's identity. That article is called The First Black Published Composer. And scholars who specialize, so around this time you have a really important generation of African-American scholars of classical music like Samuel Floyd who start talking about Lusitano, people who study the history of African-descended musicians and composers in classical music really embrace this information because it's incredibly exciting to have evidence of a person of African descent who was a composer in the 16th century. But the mainstream and traditional forces within classical music performance and scholarship, of course, don't really want to recognize that. So there's a lot of, it's a muted impact, unfortunately. And that conflict continues to this day. So that's when we get to 2020, when Joe and I meet. Now, Joe, how did we meet?
How did we meet? So I was following many of the Black Lives Matter protests in all over the world in June 2020. I saw a tweet from Alice Jones, wonderful flautist and composer, and she tweeted a picture of a placard that she was taking to the Black Lives Matter protest in New York, and it had a list of composers, black composers, many of whom I'd heard of. And there was one who stuck out to me because I'd not heard of that composer, and B, it was kind of my period. I sort of study early music. I play early music. I'm working with choirs, and I noticed these dates: 1520, 1550. I thought, 1560. I thought, my goodness, we can do some of his music, and that's where I started just Googling around. I found that Garrett had written this fan article, and weirdly for me, contacted him on Twitter as someone I'd never met, and he was kind enough to write back, which was very nice of him. And that's how we connected in that summer. And Alice has written, that she said, the point she was trying to make is that if Black Lives Matter in 2020, they mattered in 1560, and it's quite a profound way, and quite a solemn way in many ways if we think about what gave rise to those protests for us to meet actually. So yeah, it's a quite a profound place of encounter actually that we did.
It was, so in April of 2020, just to lead into this a little bit, I had published an article in Van magazine, which is a digital classical music magazine, about Lusitano. I had learned about him in 2018 from an incredible scholar named Melanie Zeck, who works at the Library of Congress, and she was Samuel Floyd's, who was a legendary Black scholar, Black classical music. She was his assistant, and so she learned about Lusitano from him, told me about him. I had taught some of his one piece that had been recorded to that point in some classes. And then after our first son was born, I was like, I should write an article about him. So a lot of that article, if you read it, it's definitely early research. Was written with one hand holding a baby, which was something I'll never forget. Prior to 2020, there had been really important breakthroughs by scholars in Europe, at the University of Tours in particular. Philippe Cunningham is this fantastic early music scholar who led an international team of researchers to dive into this manuscript treatise that was in the Bibliothèque Nationale de France, which had finally been associated with Lusitano in 1962 by Robert Stevenson. It's called Tratado de Canto do Órgão. And so they published a book in 2014, which is just a really extensive analysis of that text, and it includes a fantastic essay by a scholar named Giordano Mastrocola, which is like the definitive revisiting of Lusitano's dispute with Vicentino, and he really, really explains the whole circumstances and why he refers to, it seems Lusitano probably won because he made an argument that was not poorly constructed. That's pretty much what it came down to. Mastrocola describes Vicentino's argument, which really makes no sense when you go into the details, as an ill-conceived syllogism. So he was really not, he didn't make a very logical point, and really Mastrocola speculates that Vicentino did the whole thing as a stunt. Vicentino's patron was not politically aligned with the people in the people leading music in the papal chapel at the time. So there's a lot of interesting stuff that comes up there. And so when Joe and I start researching, it's kind of coming off of this new upswing and attention paid to Lusitano. Now, Philippe and his team don't spend a lot of time, they acknowledge Lusitano's racialized identity, but they don't spend a lot of time on it. And so when Joe and I decided, we had some Zooms, it was the summer 2020, still, early in our pandemic experience, little did we know. And so we were like, oh, we'll have some Zooms, and we were just chatting, and then about exactly 2 years ago, I was like, hey, Joe, what if we wrote a paper together about this? And it was really important to me to do something collaborative, because Joe's skill set as a early music specialist opened up so much more engagement with Lusitano's work, because I can't read, I'm not an early music specialist. I cannot read the notation that was used, and I can read it decently, but not as well as Joe. And so some of the things, knowing that this manuscript had basically been taken care of by the research from about 6 years ago, Joe and I really focused on trying to make Lusitano's music more accessible. So at the time, there were no modern editions of any of Lusitano's motets. And Joe was, there were modern editions of a piece called Heume Domine, which is a motet technically, but it's in the Trattato da Canto da Organo, and it exists as an etude to explain why it's difficult to write music in a certain style. And that's what I'll say, to put it most generally. It kind of relates to the content of the dispute with Vicentino, but it's not really a piece that's representative at all of Lusitano's style as a composer. It weirdly has become the piece that is performed the most. And it was the only piece when Joe and I met that had really the only piece of his that it had ever been performed, in at least the modern era.
I think, yeah, it was the only piece that had widespread performance and widespread scores available. Though I think that there were some transcriptions
Yes,
and models of a couple of the pieces, but they weren't easy to find.
No,
it really must be said they weren't easy to find at the time. So, yes, it was difficult to, and it was definitely difficult to know what the music other than Heume Domine, the music other than the etude, which is such a nice way of putting it. So it's difficult to know what that music sounded like. And it was quite the eye opener when we did hear it, actually. Yeah.
Yes.
In comparison to the other music, the Heume, the etude.
Yeah. So Joe, because he's a conductor, was immediately like, I want to perform these things. And it took a while because of the pandemic, but you transcribed them, and then people started to, other people were starting to, put scores that they had transcribed onto like free databases and that sort of thing. And you sort of see this really cool, if you go on YouTube and search for Vicente Lusitano performances, there's a huge burst of them in 2020. So you see a bunch of choirs performing pieces because they're finally accessible in modern notation. And Joe and I decided to focus on that, and also trying to understand more about Lusitano's identity and what it means. And so we pitched to the Journal of Musicological Research, which is a music research journal, to write an article about those two things, which is finally in the final editorial stages. It probably won't be published for like 4 years or something, but we did it, kind of. We're on the way. And the other thing that we did in terms of publications and what we were going to work on is, immediately, I don't know, I think probably me because I had access, immediately we went to Grove, which is the most important English language encyclopedia related to classical music. And we were like, what does Grove say? And the existing Grove article was frighteningly inadequate, I would say. So there were like some typos that were pretty glaring. A lot of based on the 1752 text that we mentioned before, so not a lot of updated consultating of sources, does not talk about Lusitano's identity accurately at all, refers to him as mestizo, which is not an appropriate word, and refers to a different group of people. And so Joe and I, about a year ago, went under contract with Grove and OUP to Oxford University Press to do revisions, and they should be published next month. And we talk about we talk about his music more, we talk about his identity and how the evidence is pretty clear in addition to the language that's used to describe him, what that means, how there's no ambiguity about what homem pardo means. Also the circumstances of his career aligning with limitations on Black priests. So we're very excited that people will be able to look in Grove starting in November, and it describes him as Afro-Portuguese, we're very proud of that accomplishment.
And we did that with the blessing of the author of the
With the blessing of the author,
which I think is
a very eminent early music scholar named Bonnie Blackburn.
Yeah, so very clear.
So we have, I think, we could talk a lot more if there are questions about how we worked and that sort of thing. What I will say is that we really benefited in certain ways with modern digital technology. It made it a lot easier to do a lot of the stuff that we did. A, communicate, and B, find sources and sort of catch up to what all the extant research was. An important thing about our work is that it's not really about anything new, except for analyzing Lusitano's music, which hadn't happened before. Joe did fantastic analyses of several of the motets from Liber Primus Epigrammatum, his book of Catholic motets, and then also the Protestant motet Beati Omnes. And that is more analysis than has ever been published, which is really exciting, and Joe's specialty allowed us to do that. And so as we were working, it really, this other story, especially for me, about how is it that Lusitano was so poorly represented in scholarship for so long? Why is it that people chose not to consult sources that were available, or they could have tried to consult, they could have tried harder? I mean, for us, it was easy because things were a lot easier because of digital information technology. We were able to email scholars in other fields and be like, what do you think about this? There's a really wonderful early modernist named Kate Lowe, she's kind of an art historian who specializes in representations of people of African descent in Southern Europe in the 15th and 16th century. She's written about Lusitano. In 2013, she mentioned him in an essay and expresses incredulity that historians outside of music know he's Black, but historians inside of music don't know he's Black. So that's an interesting observation by her. And we've done presentations at conferences in the UK and France. We did a presentation at Indiana University where one of the Portuguese professors attended and gave us some really helpful information. So that has made our work a lot easier and a lot faster. But I think for the students in the room, the important difference about Joe and I's work, as opposed to really until 1870, most of the scholars who worked with Lusitano, is that we chose to use this information in this way. That's all we do that's different, is that we decided to write about Lusitano in this way. And so it's important to know that sometimes the way things appear in chronologies in the historical record is because people just made a choice, and it's not because of insurmountable obstacles or anything like that. So we have a lot more to say about this, but I feel like with the time, maybe we should move on to the music and then we can take
We should play
questions.
some music.
Do you want to add anything to what I just said before we do that?
I think we should totally play the music.
Okay.
We should play the music.
Can
What do
you,
think? Does that ruin everything? Does that ruin the flow?
do you want to introduce it? No, they're going to play it
Yeah.
here. They're going to play it here, so.
Okay. Okay, cool. So I think we're about to hear. Are we about to hear the Regina Coeli?
Do you want to listen to
Yeah.
to that?
Yeah. So we're going to hear the Regina Coeli, which is
That's
a piece.
the video?
The video.
Yeah.
And that's a piece based on some plain chant that goes Regina Coeli, letare, hallelujah. Sorry, I haven't done any singing for the past month, which is really obvious. Anyway, it's for one of Lusitano's rare major mode pieces. It's really optimistic. This is a performance we gave with Chineke Voices, which is an all Black, Asian, and ethnically diverse group of singers. And we did this live in London in June, I think, 2022. Seems like a very long time ago. Yes, I think we should play it, and then you can see what you think of it.
Yes. Okay. So first of all, great job with that.
Thank you.
I have a question for you, Joe.
Oh,
As a experienced and esteemed early music choral conductor, what did you think when you saw the music for the first time? Like as from a musical point of view.
Yeah, I was surprised because I was expecting it to be incredibly chromatic because of the Heu Me Domine. And in a sense, I think that was what you were expecting too, right? And I think we were expecting something kind of wild. Now there are some wild moments in it, in the whole book, and unfortunately we don't have a recording of some. There's some really kind of scrunchy, crunchy stuff going on that we recorded in the same period for future release. But I was surprised at how kind of mellifluous it was, and I think that's grown on me more. So I think I wanted to be shocked by the chromaticism, and in the end, I kind of fell in love with the mellifluity. Is that a word? But the way it's the lovely long lines, and similarly, you know, just to sort of carry on from that, the singers that we brought together, you know, we all sort of explored and fell in love with the individual lines. Everybody gets really, really long, really lovely lines to sing, that have really nice shapes that kind of clash with other parts and move away. You would expect that in this kind of music, but there's something very special about the way he writes those long lines, especially in some of the longer pieces, some really long pieces, sort of ecstatic pieces that he writes, which are lovely. So I think I was surprised. He didn't serve up what I thought he was going to serve up. Yeah.
And the way, so this piece, like the first 8 bars or so, are analyzed in this 1962 paper by Robert Stevenson, because there's like a really unexpected harmony that happens in that phrase, and even calling it a harmony is not really accurate because they didn't think about harmony in that way, but the voice leading is very surprising. And so he's like, oh, this might be why it caught Vicentino's attention, and then he decided to sort of target Lusitano for this dispute. And because of, prior to Joe's work engraving, and then other people, and now we have performances of these pieces for the first time, you know, the only music you really knew of Lusitano's was this really chromatic piece, Heu Me Domine, and then Robert Stevenson talking about the remarkable voice leading at the beginning of this piece. And so you really, really thought it was going to be wild, wild stuff. And it is incredibly cool polyphony, but it's not quite as wild as maybe.
I mean, it's incredibly well. I mean, it's incredibly well crafted professional writing, which again begs the question: why did he not find a post in Portugal? Because I can't. We know who we think we know who he studied with. And he was as good as that person. We think he's studied with the chapel master at Évora Cathedral, or at least came under his influence in some way. And the music is of the first rate. So why wasn't he active in one of these large ecclesiastical centers as the boss? We know that he could write it. We know that he could improvise it. We know that he could write about improvising it. Those were the 3 skills that you needed to become a singing person, and then a chapel master, as they were called, in one of these institutions, and that doesn't happen. And I think whenever you hear the music, it's wonderful and glorious, but I also sort of feel there's something that's slightly poignant, or if that's the right word, or a little bit sort of bruises me a little bit that he didn't have. These should be in the choir books of Évora Cathedral or wherever in Portugal, and I think we have a really good idea of why they're not, and it's not a good reason.
His other music, you know, Beati Omnes, as this Protestant motet, as Joe said, he's as far as we know, the only Iberian-born composer who wrote both Protestant and Catholic music. And he has a madrigal too, that's not that unusual. Composers in Italy wrote madrigals which were secular and also sacred music. But he was certainly incredibly skilled and capable. And the sort of reading, a lot of times with research like this, you have to sort of look in relief of the documents that we have. And so the evidence that he was able to, there was demand for 3 editions of his composition and counterpoint manual. That shows that he, certainly there was something about his ability as a teacher and also his ability as a composer that kept him with, you know, robust employment and the need to reissue this book 3 times. And so there is a lot of merit, but he certainly wouldn't be the first, you know, musician of African descent to have merit not be enough. So I think at this point it's probably a good time to go to questions, Joe. What do you think?
Yeah, I'm very happy. I can't see anybody, so
Well,
I probably can't hear anybody either.
I think what we'll do is if somebody has a question, I'll just repeat it for you, Joe, if that's all right.
Sure.
Because there is a microphone in the audience, but we've been getting some feedback issues.
I was hearing the feedback, yeah.
Yeah, it's a really cool sonority if we're like talking about ambient music, but that's not why we're here today. Is there anything before we go to questions, anything about our research or Lusitano, like generally to wrap up that you want to say?
No, I'm more than happy to go to it. People have been listening to us for so long. Yeah.
Great. Well, does anyone have any questions then? Okay, Faith?
I don't know if you mentioned these, but do you know Vicentino's racial identity?
Oh, Nicola Vicentino. The question is, do we know Nicola Vicentino's racialized identity?
There is an existing picture of him.
Yeah, I think he was white. Yes, absolutely. Thank you. Yes, and he was very, so his patron, what was his name? I forget.
They're the Ferrarese
Yes.
family, the D'Estes.
Yes.
Yeah.
He had lost the previous papal election, and there was just a lot of like, it was a really interesting time period in like Vatican history and stuff, and Vicentino was like extremely privileged to be able to retire from Rome after losing this very public thing, spend 4 years writing an extensive treatise with all of his ideas that was published in like the finest form and then sent, you know, to all the important people in Italy. There's this great,
He's everybody's.
What?
He's our favorite like academic nemesis, right?
Yes.
He gets a 4-year writing sabbatical.
well, he's,
And then publish it.
there's this really interesting quote from another important composer in Italy at the time named Zarlino. That was his surname, I forget his first name. And he,
Josefo.
yes, Josefo Zarlino. And he was a very influential composer, particularly to subsequent generations of composers in Italy and elsewhere in Europe. And he was kind of based in northern Italy, where Lusitano ended up after he was in Rome, and Zarlino and Lusitano actually share a publisher, so maybe they knew each other. And there's a quote in Henry William Kaufman's research on Vicentino, where Zarlino, in his treatise from I think the 1570s, obliquely references Vicentino and how he will not stop going on and on and on about how he actually was right. And so he was very determined to set the record straight and used all the resources that he could to do that. And by all measure was incredibly successful, because what he writes and what Vicentino wrote in his treatise was unchallenged in music histories until 1870, and still is influential. So, yeah.
Do you think their racial identities kind of played a part in that? Like, the dominant history was
Oh, well, there are kind of two answers to that. The question is, do you think that the racial difference between Vicentino played a role in the way, I guess, maybe the dispute and then its aftermath?
Yeah, I think in the dispute, I think what's really interesting is there's a French scholar working on Ethiopian priests that we were lucky enough to be on a panel with. She's working on Ethiopian priests working in Rome in the 1550s, so exactly the same time. And we think we have some pictorial evidence of these Ethiopian priests. There was a small Ethiopian, there still is a small Ethiopian monastery behind St. Peter's in Rome, and staffed by Ethiopian priests. So, you know, so we would be able to recognize them as African persons. And she made the very powerful statement that their racialized identity is not mentioned. She can't find it anywhere. She can't find people talking about their skin color. And Kate Lowe has a similar thing where she says, you know, people will, you know, the Congolese, the Kingdom of Congo, the ancient Kingdom of Congo, they will send an ambassador. Nobody will mention this ambassador's skin color, but then they will see an enslaved person and talk about how ugly they are. So I think potentially in Italy at the time, we're dealing, we're in a state of developing ideas about kind of recognizing racialized difference. And I think what's interesting is that in Portugal, that's not the case. So in Portugal, I think we've got evidence for the fact that racialized difference was recognized and stigmatized. And certainly in Italy, it's a little bit more unclear at this time. So if that helps, Garrett, give you a sort of context for your answer.
Yeah. So one of this question speaks to one of the most difficult things about Joe's and my work, which is the way racialized identity was structured in those societies is totally alien to now. And so there's a lot of temptation to be like, oh, Lusitano was black and that means these things. But it's not the same talking about that in 2022 as it was in 1522. And that's really difficult because there's a connection, and you really have to parse out, like, in what ways can we connect, are we risking imposing modern understandings, modern biases, modern, by which I mean 21st century views on these things onto a historical figure that would have no idea what we're talking about. So that's really hard. And fortunately, there's a lot of other scholarship, not just on music, but on the diaspora studies and Black studies scholarship that we benefited from consulting, and people like Ronaldo Walcott and Saidia Hartman, who work with kind of similar people and give us a lot of framework how to talk about it. So I don't know if that's why Vicentino picked on Lusitano. I think he probably recognized that Lusitano did not have the same political support that he did. I think that's probably more likely. Maybe even something about like, oh, he's Portuguese, like I'm Italian, we're in Rome, like this is my home turf. And there were definitely some machinations through the course of the arguments, where like one of the oral arguments took place at an estate of Vicentino's sponsor and his patron, and he tried to get the judges to make a decision right then and there, obviously coercively, and they refused to because one of them the whole panel wasn't there, and like there were political shading to who was on the panel of judges and stuff, and it's almost really more of a conflict between the status quo of the musical leadership at the Vatican against this one sort of political family, as much as it is Lusitano versus Vicentino. And that kind of explains something that has bothered more recent historians who have looked into this, like Maria Barbosa, is why didn't Lusitano respond more to Vicentino? Robert Stevenson speculates that maybe Lusitano felt threatened or unstable in Rome, and that's why he left, because of Vicentino's political connections. But also, I don't know, I think that when we've gone back and looked at this, I feel like that's sort of imposing an expectation that's unfair on Lusitano. He won. Like, why would he respond? Like, he probably, I mean, his allegiance to Rome is obviously not super strong because he left. His allegiance to the Catholic Church was obviously not, permanent because he left the church. Like, for him, he won. He was getting harassed by this person continually, so I don't know why he needed to respond, but it's an interesting dynamic. There's something else I wanted to say too, but I can't remember. But I think that was interesting, I hope, at least. Any other questions? Yes?
Is there evidence that his conversion from Catholicism to Calvinism influenced his compositional technique?
Is there evidence that Lusitano's conversion to Calvinism influenced his compositional technique?
Can I take that one?
Oh, I hope so.
So again, I'm kind of, there's not a lot of things we can compare it with in terms of Iberian composers writing for how do Iberian composers change their style. There is a big stylistic change in that one piece. Like the data set is difficult because it's not that much, you haven't got a vast amount of music, you haven't got a lot of people doing it. But the change in musical style is quite pronounced. So where I talked a little bit about the long lines, and you might have heard in that Regina Caeli that there's quite a lot of melisma, so there's quite a lot of singing, stretching out words for a very long time over like a lovely line of notes. When Lusitano was writing Beati Omnes for a Protestant audience, which is very concerned with the intelligibility of the text, there's a the word to note ratio is much closer. So it's much more sort of syllabic writing. So it's potentially much clearer to the listener. So I think that there is whether it's to do with his conscience as a Calvinist, or whether it's to do with the fact that he needs to write in this style because that's the style that's prevalent of where he is, or whether he never ever wanted to write in this long melismatic style when he was in Iberia, is something we don't know. But we certainly can, it tracks with the way that, for example, English composers of the mid-16th century changed their style from very melismatic music to very syllabic music, especially when there was a change between the court of which way did it go? Sorry, Henry VIII into Edward, his son, who was a Protestant along quite European, kind of quite Calvinist lines. So I think, yes, maybe not his conversion, but certainly his writing for that community had an effect on his musical style.
A missing piece in this, Lusitano converted when he lived in Italy. We don't know exactly how long before he left Italy, although the person who wrote to Duke Christoph on his behalf said he is a good Protestant, so he had established himself as a good Protestant and married. And he doesn't have a lot of that, so far as we know. It doesn't have a lot of other music from that time. There's like one madrigal, which wouldn't really be representative. But the big thing with Lusitano is there's like enormous potential to find more information just because he hasn't been studied very much. And there are pieces that are speculated to maybe be his in libraries in Spain, I think. So
yeah, in Granada.
There's a lot of more work to be done, and there might be more music, or there might not. As when we were presenting in France virtually this summer, we talked about our work with Philippe Canguilhem, the French scholar I mentioned before, who's done really excellent work recently as well. And somebody asked, what happened to Lusitano? And we don't know. There's more study to do, and we might find more. And Philippe was like, or maybe he just became a carpenter and didn't write any other music. We have no idea. Giordano Mastrocola speculates maybe he changed his name, I think, and maybe went on, but that's totally speculative. So.
Yeah, I think a lot of us want things from Lusitano.
Yes, and that's very
it would be lovely. Yeah, it would be lovely to but who knows? And again, I think there's something about the way we think about artists is a very kind of post-romantic way that artists do art because they can't do anything else and they will do it whatever. And again, I'm sitting in Scotland. all those composers from the monasteries in Scotland, when the mass was banned, had to go and make a living doing something. So what did they do? They didn't write music not a lot of them didn't write music anymore. So I think, yeah, as post-romantic people, we want Lusitano to keep writing somewhere. And like I wanted to keep writing somewhere, but I'm not sure. That he might well have gone and just got. Sometimes people have to get jobs, right?
Mm-hmm. With that said, Joe and I are open to be sponsored to scour the archives of Europe for Lusitano's work, if anyone's listening. So,
Very.
yes.
Yeah.
Cole, yeah.
You mentioned earlier that you were surprised by the lack of chromaticism in Regina Caeli based on the study that you did of one of his earlier etudes. Was the chromaticism that you expected in the way that multiple voices harmonize with each other, or in the melodies that each individual voice sang?
That's a great question. So the question is about the sort of our misplaced expectations as to the level of chromaticism in the Regina Caeli and the other motets based on Hey You May Domine. And it's about, is the chromaticism between the parts or in individual lines? And this is a great way to explain this piece, Hey You May Domine, and why it exists. So this has to do with the specific subject matter of the dispute with Vicentino. So at the time, when we think about music in 2022 or more recent classical music, we think of it being organized in scales, but at the time a lot of people thought about it organized in groups of 4 notes called tetrachords, and they had specific definitions. And so actually what Vicentino was trying to promulgate through the dispute was his view that if you had any note in a piece that left the tetrachord, then it had to be mixed tetrachordal music, which is what he did. And he had this whole aesthetic of chromatic music that mixed all the tetrachords and maintained their exact tunings from Boethius, so the Roman, and Pythagoras before Boethius. And so Vicentino invented a keyboard instrument with 31 keys that were tuned specifically so that you could have all these differently tuned notes happening at the same time. Lusitano's position was basically nobody sings music that way because it's too hard, and from an intonation standpoint. And this piece, Hey You May Domine, appears in the Trattato da Canto da Organo manuscript as an example, and he describes it as, this piece exists to show how difficult it would be to sing music that maintained these specific intonations. It's not that hard to do in an individual part, but when you have multiple singers, it becomes very, very difficult to respect that sort of original definition of the tetrachords, specifically the chromatic tetrachord. There are 3, that's one of the 3 that they were talking about. And so the piece, what's interesting about the piece when it's performed now is it doesn't use the tunings that they were talking about. It's kind of a sanitized version that uses modern accidentals, and so it's not even an accurate representation. When it's performed now, it's really cool chromatic music, but it's not even what Lusitano wrote. There was different notation that it used and that sort of thing. And so because of that, with that being the only starting point, you sort of get the impression that Lusitano must have been really, really interested in this very esoteric, sort of theoretically based chromatic composition. And the truth is actually he was not, because it was, his perspective, Maria Barbosa sort of summarizes his perspective as being sort of like a performer-centered scholar who's worried about, practically executing these ideas, whereas Vicentino was more of a tinkerer who wanted to sort of push the envelope in that way. I think going back to Faith's question about why did Vicentino's ideas why were they more popular? There are these political reasons, but also I think at the time in the 17th century and the 18th century, Vicentino fit into this scientific narrative of innovation. He invented an instrument to play things this way. The way he defined these specific tunings was highly mathematical and used physics and that sort of thing. And Lusitano didn't do any of that. It was basically like, it's too hard to hear these differences. And so people shouldn't write music this way. People don't write music this way. And so there's kind of a change in the focal point of what classical music is at the time towards technology like instrumental performance, keyboard performance, away from all vocal music.
Also,
yep.
Oh, sorry, I was going to say, and also sorry to interrupt, but thinking about that post-romantic idea,
Yes.
the idea, Vicentino is incredibly attractive to the late 18th, early 19th century because he's the genius who's moving
Yes.
things forward, and Lusitano's the kind of fuddy-duddy who's trying to pull things back. So,
Yeah.
so again, it suits people's agendas at the time. Yeah.
I think particularly like because as far as I can tell, well, I guess it did, Vicentino's treatise did make it to England, and this narrative made it to England. But a lot of it was in Italy, it was pretty localized. And then when Machado does his thing in 1752, which is like the height of, this sort of like Renaissance, the Enlightenment thinking, like Vicentino really fits into that. He was also, his treatise ended up accidentally sort of being influential on later generations of Italian composers, so he had more of this like artistic genealogy to add weight to his work that Lusitano doesn't really. So, but yeah, so going off of that one piece, Heu me Domine, which is the way it sounds and even though they're totally inaccurate modern performances, it's like really amazing music, whatever it is. It's sort of like I don't know, it's like a weird simulation of what Lusitano was trying to do. Going from that, you're like, wow, this guy must have been really, really experimental. And his music does unusual, unexpected things, but they're just more nuanced and subtle and not as like bombastic as you would think they might be. So, Jackie, yeah. Mm-hmm. I'm sorry, what was the question?
I think he said it was Black Saint.
Yes.
Confirm
Who is the author of Black Saints that you referenced before?
Erin Kathleen Rowe, R-O-W-E.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Oh, great.
Yeah, great book.
We've really tried to be as interdisciplinary as possible, and especially the discussion of Lusitano's identity and what it means, and that's been imperative because even though there is a long tradition of people writing about Black classical musicians and composers, particularly other Black scholars, Lusitano doesn't appear in that because nobody knew, and also it's not it's not as extensive an academic tradition as it could be. So we really because of obvious reasons. And so we've really depended on being able to bring in research from other fields in order to make sense of what it means that Lusitano is a person of African descent. And we've really benefited our editor at the Journal of Musicological Research, Hilary Porras, has been incredibly welcoming to that. The fact that, to do a co-authored article, which we're doing, is pretty unusual in music, which is maybe not the best thing. And so they've really been generous with us in order to sort of research this and tell this story in the way that we want to. Except we do have to follow their word limits, which is really hard. So, but any other questions?
I was thinking one thing, even can you identify erasure
Mm-hmm.
as the person in Portugal who started writing negative racial narratives about people of African descent?
Mm-hmm.
And I wonder
I,
And Desirara predates Lusitano.
oh, I was going to ask what time period, because there's a lot of, I don't, does that, Gomez Desirara? So the question is about Gomez Desirara, who was a Portuguese, a racist Portuguese writer. Oh, he started the racist ideology, and he lived before.
Oh, right, yeah, so that's quoted in Kendi, isn't it?
Oh, yeah, that's what he,
Yeah,
that's what.
yeah. So it's really good, and I love the way Kendi sort of frames it as the beginning of a sort of a fungible blackness because of the sort of spectacle of or a fungible Africanness. There's a spectacle of landing these kidnapped and enslaved people, this kind of ritual, and they're split off not by family or national identity, but just into random groupings. And I think Kendi says they become one. I think the quote is it. He says they become one inferior people. Is that the quote? I think it's an incredible kind of description. And yet Desirara, the chronicler, writes about that. And as I'm aware, there is this extraordinary moment, isn't there, where the enslaved people begin to sing. Is that correct? Which is chilling and extraordinary, and kind of something that I'd love somebody to do some work on, about the presence of music in that situation. But yeah, sorry, what was the question? I was just so excited about
it. Was just about the it was just about the possible connection to our work. I don't.
Well, I think, yeah, I mean, I would say that I mean, as I kind of said in halting form at the beginning, that like the context for Lusitanos growing up is in the Portugal post-Zurara Portugal. If that helps, if that makes sense.
The one I don't, Joe knew that name more quickly. I can't recall if I looked at any work by that particular writer. But the thing something that we really wanted to do, because there's such scant primary or documentation of Lusitano's identity, is be like, what does this word pardo mean? Like, does it ever change meaning? Let's look into the history of this. We've benefited because last year there was some excellent English language linguistics work by Portuguese scholars about it, so that was good timing, fortunately. But it's a very specific word that's used more in Brazil later, but there are instances of it appearing in plays before Lusitano's lifetime and in other histories written during Lusitano's lifetime, describing people with presumably similar backgrounds. So like the children of Portuguese nobles and African women who had some social mobility, but were nonetheless, not given full agency as members of Portuguese society. And so there's the other research about it that at least we could access or read, because it's published in English, has to do with the plays of Gil Vicente, the Portuguese playwright. Many of them have characters who are referred to as Pardo, or there's a play called Maria Parda, which is the title character is mixed race, and that's a site, that's a cultural site that's a site of Portuguese culture that's been explored in the last few decades. It's like a place where these negative stereotypes were formulated. And it was very, very valuable, since similar to what we were talking about before, like it was not common for everyone to refer to people with Lusitano's identity, and everyone in 16th century Europe to automatically refer to him as being black or something like that. So we really benefit from the fact that he was from Portugal, where they were intent on labeling people like this, perversely of course, and that the language stayed so consistent over time. One of the things that, especially not really in Joe's and my work, but when we started it, there was a lot of more commonly held doubt over the veracity of the information reflecting Lusitano's identity. Oh, there's only one document, do we really, do we know, there needs to be a second source. Something we've talked about before is like the Wikipedia page about him has a lot of background discussion that's like horrifying because people are like, we can't believe any of this. And it's like, well, there's like more evidence than just that one thing because of his career and stuff. And what really helps is that we know what the words that are used to describe him mean. We know that the meaning hasn't changed. And so it gives us a lot of confidence to say it's not a mistake. It's also a word that's used in a lot of official documentation or histories, and so it's like really a specific word with a very clear meaning, and so that gives us the confidence that it means what we think it means. And it helps that Portugal was so intent on participating in that sort of discourse, too. Cool. Anything else? Any other questions? Joe, do you want to say anything else?
I mean, I think whoever asked the question about, what was Vicentino's racialized identity, I mean, I think that's really interesting, because it's the first person I think that's ever assumed that's ever said, the place from there that question comes from is a place where there's a possibility that not everybody involved in this scene in 16th century Italy was white, And I think that was pretty cool. I've not heard somebody ask that before, and I think there is this assumption, to go back to it, that the 16th century is monochrome. I think there's also something, and when we talk about Pardo, we talk about those words about the fragility of or the ease with which blackness is erased in white supremacist societies. It's quite common, and it happens now. And the curious needs we feel to verify whether or not somebody is or not. Could they possibly be? What's the evidence for this? And it's a curious need that we have to find extra documentary evidence. I mean, Sam Brannan, wonderful scholar of 16th century music and of Lusitano, the same manuscript that says José Pardo said he was born in Olivenza. And, if I'd come here and said Lusitano was born in Olivenza, I imagine probably nobody would have gone, really, no, I'm not sure. I mean, really, could he have been born in Olivenza? Why wasn't he? Could have been born in Evora. I mean, there's a lack in the imagination, unfortunately, of the world in which we inhabit, that there's a lack of plausibility for Black presence at this time and making this music. And I would really appreciate that question about what was Vicentino's racialized identity. It's the first person's ever asked that, so thank you for saying that.
It was one of the students from my class, so I'll let her know on Monday or tomorrow. So, well, I think that it's probably a good place to stop. We're almost at time, and we've had a wonderful discussion. I just want to thank the library for hosting us and having this amazing room that could accommodate bringing us together across the Atlantic. I desire desperately for Joe and I to be in the same place, but for now this does pretty well. And thank you all of you who are here and asked questions. It was a very receptive audience, and
yes, thank you.
And whoever, I don't know if whoever is watching this in the future or watching us right now, thank you for joining us too. And you should go, and I'll plug Joe, because he, in addition to doing this tour of concerts in June, the group that he worked with recorded an album that will come out in the future. There is a commercial album, the first commercial album with Lusitano's, well, not the first ever with his music, but with his motets. was released a couple weeks ago by a different group that did a wonderful job, the Marian Consort. But I'm highly biased and excited for Joe's album to come out. So
That's very kind.
well, thank you all very much, and
Thank you so much
Thank you,
for
Joe,
having
for joining us.
That's a pleasure. Thanks for having me. It's really nice to see you.
Yes. Great.
Bye-bye.